As Ray reminded us, this week's gospel lesson has its roots in last week's story. You'll recall that Jesus was teaching at the local synagogue when he was confronted by a crazy man. With a word of authority, Jesus silenced that evil spirit in the man, told it to come out of him, and the spirit convulsed and shrieked, and as if it were holding on with its death grip almost, until Jesus' words just pulled it apart and sent it scurrying back into the darkness from which it came. And everyone was astounded who happened to be at church that day. They exclaimed, "This must be some kind of new teaching," which is exactly what would happen if you and I, if that happened in this room today and I drove an evil spirit out, all of you would say, "That is really a great Sunday school curriculum." A marvelous teaching. And so they leave the synagogue and walk a very, very short distance in Capernaum from the synagogue to where Peter and Andrew shared a home. And along the way, they're probably marveling at what they've just seen take place in worship. It's been really an astounding morning for them. And along the way, Andrew gets beside his brother and kind of nudges him and says, "You going to tell him?" And Peter's already ahead of him. "Teacher, my mother-in-law, she's been really sick this week. And she's not getting better." And then Peter begins to talk about his mother-in-law. How she'd come to live with him and his wife after their marriage. How she had raised his wife since she was 6, all on her own when her husband died suddenly. How she loved to garden. And how she was a wonderful, wonderful baker of bread. And how she was always asking him, "When are you going to make me a grandmother, Peter?" Now, Jesus heard more than the words. He heard about Peter's care for his mother-in-law, understood that they had a relationship, that he loved his mother-in-law as if she were his own mother. I get that. My mother-in-law lives with us. This summer will make 10 years she's lived with us. She's part of our family. She is from when I first began dating Vicki. What do I need to call you? Just call me Mama. She's been Mama ever since. 32 years. No, 37 years. Oops. Be healed. And I picture that Jesus put his arm around Peter's shoulders and said, "It's going to be okay." And together they walk into the house. And Jesus goes right into where she is. Says she's been in bed with a fever. We know about fevers. It's going around, right? She's in bed with a fever, and she's delirious with fever. Fevers have a way of doing that. Those of you who've had a fever, I remember last year when I got deathly ill with one for 3 days. It was awful. It leaves you so weak that you really don't know where you are. You don't care where you are. Every joint in your body hurts, and despite the fever running higher and higher, you keep shivering because you can't get over the chills. And you don't know whether to be afraid that you're going to die or afraid that you won't. Jesus approaches her, doesn't even put Purell on his hands. And Mark paints this simple scene with vivid words. He approaches her bedside, and it says that he reaches out his hand and takes her hand in his own. And I picture that the hand, like many people who have a fever, is probably limp, somewhat lifeless. She's probably got her eyes closed, and then maybe they begin to flutter open. She's wondering who it is that is holding her hand. And then it says that he lifts her hand and begins to lift her as if he's inviting her to go dance. And she gets right up out of the bed, and he begins to walk her around the room until he gets to the place where, stand up here, Sherry. Now picture this. He's got her by the hand, and he's walking her around the room, and then he does a little pirouette, and she just kind of twists around. And they're dancing all the way into the kitchen, where she says, "You boys must be hungry." And she starts to cook something until they realize that Peter's still over in the corner just blubbering away. Thank you. It's a beautiful image. This is so tender. It's just Mark's wonderful way of adding these vivid details that help us enter into the story and see this wonderful woman for who she is. Mark says that she began to serve them. She saw in each of them something feverish, and she knew that they needed a mother's touch. Her mother's touch. Moved with compassion and gratitude, she serves them, because to be healed again is to be reunited with her family, with these neighbors, because illness has a way of robbing us of who we are and what we love to do. Outside the house, a crowd has been growing in the twilight. News of the crazy man has been spreading through the countryside like wildfire. And all kinds of people have gathered outside of Peter's home. And they have politely waited until sundown. It is the Sabbath, after all. And they have waited until sundown in hopes that they will be able to meet Jesus, these walking wounded who are in search of their own hope, some relief from their grief, some cure for their ailments. And Mark tells us that the people just kept on bringing them. Late into the night, Jesus works. And by morning, Peter's yard is strewn with crutches and bandages from people who no longer need them. In my first year here, I joined Richard Young on one of his medical missions in the hill country of Chiapas, Mexico. Many of you have been there as well. In those small villages, I watched as this scene unfolded before my very eyes. We would drive into these little villages, and within an hour, the word had spread all around, and people came out of the woodwork to see the doctor. People who cared about them, people who wanted some kind of hope, were the ones who led the way, just like they did in Mark's gospel. People flocked to Jesus because they believed that there really is something greater than their illness, greater than their problem. It is perhaps the hardest thing to believe when we're being crushed by whatever it is that is happening to us. Which is why pity, compassion, makes such a difference. Compassion literally means to suffer with, come, passion. Passion, suffer, come alongside. To suffer alongside of another person. Pity comes from the Latin word piety and pious, which has nothing to do originally with our association of those words with some kind of spiritual practice. The word literally meant kindness. And pity and compassion, kindness, whatever word you want to use, is the way that we continue Jesus' ministry. And it's something that we experience Christ working with us, but also working through us. Because every one of us, in this sense, can be healers like Jesus. We can be people who bring compassion, who exercise pity, who take care of people around us. You don't have to have a medical license to be able to do that. And it's such an important part of who we are as people of faith. So what does it mean for us to act with pity, to respond to pity? How does this become a spiritual practice of ours? How do we understand ourselves to be compassionate, full of passion for others, in a way that doesn't overwhelm us, but in a way that we experience God's power for them and through us? I changed doctors last year. I went to the doctor who had seen my mother for the 18 months that she lived here in the community. I went to him because I remembered how he treated her. When we first moved her to town and got an appointment, I remember he came into the room And he had his clipboard and all that other kind of stuff. And the first thing he did is he set it down on the desk and he got in the rolling chair and he rolled right up in front of my mother and said, "Tell me about Edith." Boy, he sold me right there. And during all the time that we went to him, there were lots of conditions that my mom brought. But he never once saw her first as the presenting condition. He saw her as Edith. It's Michael's mom, new resident of Cartersville, former nurse, a woman with a keen, wicked little sense of humor. He got to know my mom in remarkable ways. So when I had the opportunity to change doctors last year, I did that. The stories of Jesus healing other people are told in much the same way that transpired between the doctor and my mom. Because people have stories, and illness is only a part of their story. And illness is something that we have, but it's not who we are. In my first pastorate, I went to visit a woman at her home who was in the last stages of cancer. She was sitting there in the hospital bed, and when I walked into the living room, she looked up at me and she put the book down in her lap and she said, "Michael, I have cancer, but cancer doesn't have me." What an unbelievable conversation about healing. In the 5th chapter of Mark, a woman sneaks up behind Jesus and touches the hem of his robe. It's a beautiful story. We'll study it later in the year. And he pauses to look around the crowd because he knows somebody has reached out and touched him, and he senses it in him. And he finds the woman who suffered from an illness for more than a dozen years. And Mark tells us this intriguing little detail, that when he found her, he looked at her, and she told him the whole story. What is the whole story of 12 years of treatments and doctors and failures sound like? And Jesus stood there and listened to all of it. Sometimes it can be hard to look at somebody who is ill. It can be frightening to remind us that we ourselves can be vulnerable. It may unsettle us because we don't have a good word to offer them for their question, "Why is this happening to me?" But to look and to listen may not cure someone, but it goes a long way toward bringing healing. And it brings the presence of God to them. God's greatness and power can feel the furthest from us when we're struggling with an illness. But Mark offers us this different picture of greatness. The greatness of God is the greatness that walks out among us, that moves his way through the crowd, that holds hands and has conversations with people. It's not just the action of healing them and then sending them away, but of looking and listening to who they are and what's going on. And then Mark goes off and says that Jesus leaves that next morning early to go pray. And it's out of that prayer that he discerns that there are other people just like the people in Capernaum. Which gives me hope that Jesus is constantly on the move to where you are and where I am, in order to bring a word of hope and his touch of healing and his presence to us in our most needful times. Who are the people who help you, listen to you, who see you for who you are? And then who are the people that you do that for? That's how you're the presence of Christ. And it's how we exercise compassion. Another way is we do it through touch. Jesus used touch in his ministry of healing, and each time we use touch, we're bringing again the presence of Christ to a person in need. I have watched doctors perform exams on patients and watched as their hands were able to discern something deep beneath the skin that was not right. I have held the hand of a young woman who was losing her 4th child to a miscarriage. While the nurses looked on, we both just wept and wept. I've watched the devoted husband tenderly touch the fevered forehead of his wife as she lay dying in hospice and how that touch seemed to ease her pain. I've taken olive oil and I've anointed the foreheads of close friends prior to surgery. I've gathered with handfuls of some of you around church members in this congregation as we have laid hands and prayed for them prior to a surgery or to a treatment. And each time touch has allowed us to share compassion in ways that have been surprising and miraculous. Something happens when we connect. In my first year of seminary, I was assigned to work as a chaplain at what is now the Atlanta Medical Center. I was working on an extended care floor, which meant people had gone there for rehab. And on my first day there, we were giving a tour, and there was a man mumbling. He'd had a stroke, and it was obvious that his speech had been terribly impaired. And we walked by his room, and I could hear this. He sounded like the crazy man from last week's lesson. And I remember asking my supervisor, I said, what happens if I get somebody like that? And she says, I don't know. Guess who was my patient? I went back the next week, and there he was. And as soon as I walked into the room, he started, that's the most he could articulate. Had one good arm. Scared me to death. This little preacher is so dependent on words. And I couldn't ask him to tell me, where do you hurt? What can I do? Tell me your story. I knew nothing about him. There was no chart there. I didn't even have a real name. Just had a last name. And I started doing everything that you are supposed to do when you see somebody like that. I went and found a nurse and told him that he needed help. Passed it off to somebody else. But I knew that it was ultimately my responsibility. So later that afternoon, I went back. And I started doing all kinds of things. I fluffed his pillow and got him a glass of water. I turned the TV on. I changed channels, turned the TV off. I was just doing all kinds of things. And I could tell I was wearing him out and I was wearing myself out. And finally, I'd walked over to the bed, and he grabbed me with one good hand and started trying to write something in my palm. And then he reached up and like he was blind, and he started feeling my face. And finally, I pulled up a chair, and I said, Bud, I was trying to be chummy. I later learned that it was his nickname, Buddy. I don't know what you're trying to tell me, but how about if I just sit here for a while with you? And I took his hand, and he got very quiet. And we sat there for about a half hour. I went to school the next day, and I told one of my colleagues, who was also a chaplain, what had happened, and she said, oh, I know that room. I was there last night. His roommate died. And I came to discover that Buddy had been in the room when the roommate got into difficulty. And it was a shared room, so they drew a curtain all the way around Buddy. And he heard all of this activity going on. And then it got real quiet. When they drew the curtain back, the bed was empty. And the nurse walked out and closed his door. Sometimes touch can heal the wounds that are not visible to us, because it reminds people they're not alone. The Word did become flesh, and it lived among us. Now, care and compassion can burn us out. Jesus helps us to balance our ability to be compassionate and caring without burning out. And he gives us the model right there. After all of this activity of caring and touching and listening and responding, he goes off early in the morning and he sits in a deserted place and he just reflects. And reflection is so important to our spiritual lives. All of the Gospels, you understand, are written reflections. It's the people who think back and simply recall what their experiences were. We're all so busy. We're running 90 to nothing. And we run from one activity to another, from one place to another, from one responsibility to another. And without reflection, we start to get disconnected from what do those things have to do with the life that God's called us to lead. And so in reflecting, Jesus is able to think back on the previous day and all of those people, and he begins to see a pattern. The pattern of hurt that exists in Capernaum is probably pretty much true throughout all of Galilee. And it helps him get clarity about where he's to go next. But it's also a time of reflection because he thinks back about all of the people that he met, all of the stories that he heard, all of the people who brought those loved ones who were hurting. And he began to have this amazing gratitude for how much of the goodness of God was so present in what we think is just ordinary stuff. And that reflection then gives him renewal. It's what allows him to get up that morning and say, we can do more of this. This is why I've come. There are other places that need words of hope and touches of hope, gestures that remind people they're not alone and that God's with them. And that sometimes when there's not a cure, there can still be healing. So take time to find times to reflect, to sit down with another person, just go back through your day. What happened today? Help reconnect all of those frayed ends so that you see where God has been present with you and through you. Where God has come to you, and you will find yourself soaring like an eagle. You'll have some perspective. You'll find a renewed vigor where all of this running doesn't simply exhaust you. And that sometimes you'll discover, even in the midst of all that's going on, being able to walk and put one foot in front of the other is grace enough. Because that power comes only from God. And it's the reflecting that puts you back in touch with it, that connects you to it, and connects you to your own ministry in the world. So we come here to the table to do precisely that, to keep reflecting on this amazing story of healing, that on the night Jesus gave himself up for us, he took bread, and when he had broken it, because Lord knows he had seen his share of brokenness everywhere he traveled. But he said in the breaking that there was something else happening. That compassion was putting those things back together. He said, so take and eat this, and every time you do, remember. Remember. Be nourished, be refreshed, be recharged. And then he took a cup, and again he gave thanks. And he said, this cup is a new covenant, a new possibility. It's poured out for the forgiveness of sins, but it's poured out for so much more than that. It's poured out for the healing of the world. We take this bread and we drink from the cup, and we remember these things. That Christ is with us. Reflect on that. Savor it. And be renewed by it.